because we are going to now open up a little discussion among ourselves, and I'd like to also invite some of the other guests at the table to issue some comment. Let me give a better presentation of the other five members of this panel. Starting from here, we have Yves Meny, who is a politologist or political scientist, but in fact he's the president of the Sant'Anna School in Pisa, right? You are a bit Italian, a little bit?
A lot.
Oh, okay, very good. That's good for us. He's been really involved in political analysis. As I said earlier, he was the author of the paper that the Fondazione had asked me to write about the governance of Venice. Charles Landry. Very hard to define Charles Landry, but if I have to use a word, I would say an inventor, a creative inventor, because he's really been, really at the helm of many movements around the world for innovating cities and bringing creativity at the core of cities development, a bit like we just heard now. Then we have Greg Richards from the Tilburg University in the Netherlands. You teach a very interesting topic, placemaking. We want to hear about that because it's an interesting issue for Venice. I'm sure you will have a lot to contribute. I think I spoke about Pierre Wellinger. I met him 30 years ago. I think we are old now. It's the only advantage of getting old. You know everybody at the end. And Pierre has done many things in his life as a climatologist, but certainly he is known in the world for being the founder of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is probably the father of the international treaty, on climate change, and everything that you hear about climate change has its origin in this panel that was created by you and other people, of course, but in the 80s, right? I think, yes. And has been involved in Venice safeguarding for a long time. And finally, Charles Perrings, who is an environmental economist. Can I define that like this? From Arizona State. Is very much interested in the economic impacts of ecological changes. So, as you see, we have a variety here. I would like to start, if you allow me, with one question which I will address to Pierre, but it can go to anybody else. But it's the word that you have used, the first word you have used, resilience. And this is very, very important. Resilience is for Venice, has been for 1,500 years, the buzzword. They didn't call it like this, but it was this, how to withstand difficult environment, how to withstand not only enemies, but the sea and everything. Now, resilience is clearly at the core of every environmental and I would say social policy. There's two things. There's environmental and social resilience. And I think we should really study this a little bit more and maybe bring it up front when we talk about the future of Venice. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? And I'll probably ask you the same, Charles, and maybe others can intervene, but then we will try to enrich the discussion. Please, Pierre.
Yes, thank you. About my work, climatologist, well, I'm mainly interested in how climate change impacts us in the field of energy, water and food, living, coastal problems. So I'm focused on what it does to people. And well, of course, knowing climate change, we do not know exactly how it will hit us, whether a storm or a drought or a flood. And this is so vague that we started to look from the people. How capable are you of dealing with something which, in fact, occurs relatively slowly? It creeps on you, on a society, and are you capable in dealing with that? And then, of course, the social tissue becomes very, very important. And as you introduced this notion of how resilient is Venice, well, I tend to agree with Joan Busquet, with such a rich history and with having so much attention from the world, so many creative people want to visit Venice already in their early life. I think basically the city and its social tissue, including the tourists, I mean, definitely, is a resilient system because it touches on all of us. And so I'm not pessimistic about the future of this city. There is enough energy, capacity, creativity, but indeed that includes the world as a whole, that includes the tourists who come here, who may bring money and may overexploit the city, but they also bring ideas. And so I think resilience is, well, Rotterdam is part of this Rockefeller group, and being part of that group, you know, kind of revigorates also citizens in let's sit together and think about our future. And already sitting together helps you to be more creative and more united. In the Netherlands, I evaluated some 100 projects that said we do on adaptation to climate change. And we tried to analyze what was special on this project, because people think adaptation to climate is expensive. We found out hardly anybody knew what it had cost to adapt to climate, because as a group they were so creative to invent new solutions. And there are quite a few examples in the Netherlands where by being forced to think about the future, you reconsider the past and say, hey, maybe we can do things differently in the future, coming up with better solutions and less costly solutions where people buy into the system. So I think resilience is important, and it's not just a physical thing, it's maybe primarily a social tissue thing. The power to organize yourself with inside and outside energy to see how can we manage. And resilience is much broader than being able to deal with climate change. It has to do with dealing the whole list that was mentioned on resilient cities, shocks, creeping shocks and sudden shocks. So I think it's a good concept, but of course it's not a very positive concept. I mean, I would rather call it towards innovation. Resilience has a kind of defensive connotation. So I would say, how can you transform also this word into a more robust, increasing robustness of the system? That's what people like better than decreasing the resilience. So far, my little comment, Frederick.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for pointing out this very important difference, and which is, you know, makes sense also in the case of Venice. But Charles, perhaps you have something to add from the deserts of Arizona. Where do you live, in Phoenix or in Tucson?
Very, very close to Phoenix.
Phoenix.
But, and I'm in a city that prides itself on being resilient, and yet it has all sorts of characteristics that make it very far from resilient. But that's not what I want to say here. Resilience is a concept that has a meaning only in an uncertain world. What you're trying to do is to assure the capacity to respond positively to stresses and shocks, and to identify the areas where you're likely to face the next set of shocks. And in the case of Venice, it appears that there are two broad sets of shocks that are confronting Venetians, one of which is climate and the consequences of changing sea levels and so on. And the other is how to live in a world in which the economy is driving changes in tourism that by altering the stresses on the city are forcing the city to rethink its future. So the city is being forced to think about responses to a different set of shocks from those that are occurring as a result of climate change. I think there's a huge opportunity in this, because if you imagine all of the major shocks that have occurred over the past century, it's a small proportion of those that come from surprises from the natural environment. Most of those are coming from surprises that originate in society, surprises that occur through geopolitics, surprises that occur through technological innovations. And I do think that there's scope for thinking about the technological innovations that can prompt, steer, that can encourage development of new ways of thinking about reacting to change. So even though it is somewhat defensive, I think it offers, as a concept and as a stimulus to programmer development, great opportunities.
That's very good. Change is the word that you use, very, very important. And how to react to change is something that sometimes, when we look at Venice, we sort of, we take change as an external force, not as an internal force, but it should become an internal force. Force for changes. Yves, I think we're talking about politics here, so please.
I would be tempted to react not so much in terms of politics, but rather in terms of what is social change, by contrast to technical change. We tend to focus on technical changes, robotics, informatics, etc. But we tend to forget that extremely important changes are just a new combination of factors. Let me take an example. Ryanair or EasyJet have not invented the planes. They have not invented airports. Airbnb has not invented anything, except a new technology for housing, for hosting people, and the software, yes. So, and there is a third model which is closest to Italians. Italy. I'm not talking about the country. I'm talking about a company, EATLY, Italy. That is this company, this Italian company, who has invented a new way of providing food, quality food, to people internationally. They have not invented the pasta. They have not invented wine. They have not invented oil. They provide good quality products in Italy and elsewhere. And I think it seems to me that this could be a kind of model for Venice, not in the field of food, but in the field of artisan, in the field of craft, because what would be important, for instance, in Venice, would be to show to the tourist that there are some glasses which cost €1. They come from China, but nobody knows they come from China. There are masks who are produced, I don't know where, and which are sold €2. So what is lacking in Venice is a kind of artisan center where people could, first of all, work together, because if there is a great quality of Italian artisan, is the capacity to collaborate and to work together in clusters. There are many clusters of that type in Italy, in furniture industry, in mechanical industry, in textile industry, in shoe industry. There is a great capacity to collaborate. And this should be probably brought to Venice in the field which is suggested by Richard Sennett. But it should be also a place where people could be secure and to get the stuff produced by craftsmen in Venice or its region. While today, there is a kind of lie. Many tourists believe they are buying glasses from Murano, which are obviously produced elsewhere. So having this kind of strategy to promote production, new production, innovation, but at the same time to find places where this product could be found and sold to tourists would be already a big step. A second remark I would like to make is that Bonnie Burnham has made a certain number of suggestions about, in particular, the American experience. I think these suggestions have to be translated into, I would say, European or Italian norms and labeling. But these are excellent suggestions, in particular in the field of housing. I think what is tragically lacking in Venice is a housing policy in order to allow people working in Venice to live and work in Venice and not to be transformed into commuters with the terraferma. What is lacking, it's a policy which allows students to live in Venice and not to be commuters between the historical city and terraferma. Again, in order to bring life again into these neighborhoods of Venice, which are completely empty and desert once the tourists have left at 8 o'clock with the last train. You know? So there are a lot of possibilities. I would certainly elaborate further tomorrow. But what is lacking in Venice is a cluster of positive and negative incentives. For the time being, the only incentives are market incentives. There is very little of public negative, for instance, taxing tourists, or positive, offering better services to tourists. And it's what we have to, I think, to think about for the future.
Well, thank you very much. I think you pointed to what everybody thinks is the core of say, difficulties that Venice is encountering. It's becoming a mono-touristic, mono-sectoral economy, tourism. And its great traditions, artisans, and are a bit either lost or not valued. And this is something that Senate pointed correctly, and I think it's something that perhaps should be reflected more, and perhaps we will during this conference. Of course, it touches on the issue of creativity, Charles. You're dealing with many cities, in your professional life. How to make creativity a spring of their economic development? How this can be applied to Venice, or at least you can elaborate on it.
Well, I'm always thinking, since everything has already been said about Venice and about so many ideas have already been had, it sort of makes me feel sort of slightly impotent at one level. But I'm always then thinking, what are the triggers in cities that create transformative moments? And what I find interesting about Venice, sorry, I will come to creativity, is the urgency and all of these things is said and the points are all made, but nothing seems to really shift and create a transformative moment. So I'm thinking, since the shock effect doesn't seem to work, what can be the effect that could work? And increasingly, I believe that cities that enable themselves to allow the conditions to think, plan, and act with imagination, actually, a lot of it is psychological. I personally think there's a psychological problem here. And that is never in discussion about city making. Cities that often do well, actually as a city, as a collection, as an organism, are actually psychologically, talking about resilient, they're not only resilient, they're psychologically quite strong in a positive way. And what I'm surprised about, is the moment you explore Venice, there's lots of creative potential and creative stuff going on. If we take a helicopter view, we of course know it's all there. But how does it agglomerate and become critical mass and become visible? And I think one central message hasn't come through. It's a bit like it's trapped, as if nobody has actually said, in simple terms, a narrative which actually says, what kind of place do we want to be? And what this kind of place that we want to be, and I will elaborate on this tomorrow, has to focus on the young, just picking up Eve's point. Everybody's talking about the aging population. If someone said, the place we want to be is a place for the young, as distinct from any other story, then a whole series of things, I think, would be unleashed. Then if we ask, where could these places be where the young could agglomerate and could stay, and we discussed this over lunch, where is the campus? If that simple story were there about, focused completely on the young, forget tourism, forget all these other things, that'll happen in any case, and then work backwards from that, I think one would unleash incredible potential, and there are all these spaces which we can explore tomorrow. So how do places start the creative process if they're in a bit of trouble? The first thing is they're honest about realities. They're not in denial. And this is where I think the psychological question lies. Once they do that, then they tend to start with values. And those values are the things that then drive this. And these stories that they tell themselves that gives them the psychological strength are often incredibly simple. But what they have, if I encapsulate it, they're strategically principled and tactically flexible. Now, if there's anything that fits the Italian mindset is to be tactically flexible. But the strategic principles, and there's probably only three things I think need to be said. And in my view, the first one is youth, the young, because everybody's talking about the old. I think that's such a wonderful message, because heritage and the young, I think that's a beautiful combination, because we associate the young with creativity, new ideas. Not all of their ideas are good, of course. Lots of them are complete rubbish, but it doesn't matter. But if one has that context, which may be this educational context, which may be this open campus, I feel that, I'm not really answering your question in the way you wanted, but does it matter? Oh, yeah. That, I feel, is one unleashing point. Basically, in other words, what I'm saying is I don't think there's a problem about creativity in Venice. I think there's a hell of a lot in here already, and there's a hell of a lot of outsiders who want to be creative with the Venetians together.
Sure, thank you very much. I think you spoke about creativity, but now I think Greg, the last one of this group of five, I think you're an expert in tourism, so perhaps you have a different voice. Let us know your voice.
Yeah, it's probably not good to admit to being an expert in tourism in a city which often doesn't like having the tourists around. But for me, tourism is just one form of movement of people in cities. And in fact, to talk about tourists is a very narrow view of that kind of movement, because we are all tourists in a way. We're tourists as well. But we wouldn't be viewed in the same way as people picnicking on the floor in San Marco. That's a different kind of tourism, but in fact, it's a movement of people. So I tend to steer away from the word tourism, and in fact, I much rather talk about the label that you mentioned earlier, which is placemaking. And tourists are one part of the story of how places are made. If places are attractive, people will come to them. People will live in them, people will visit them, people will work in them. And so placemaking is quite simply the art of making places better. And of course that sounds simple, but it's very, very complicated, because it involves not just the physical making of a place, which is something that architects have been getting better and better at doing over the centuries. But it also involves making those places mean something to the people who live in them and the people who visit them and invest in them and so on. And this is something which Barcelona has been excellent at. It is not just the physical environment which is so wonderful in Barcelona, but the way that the people in Barcelona interact with that physical environment to provide meaning for the city of Barcelona. Venice is the same. It has a significance and meaning which goes way beyond the beauty of the physical environment itself. So for me, placemaking is a mixture of the physical environment, the meaning that that physical environment has, and the creativity which is used by the people of the city to give the meaning to the physical spaces. So it's a whole system of meaning making, which makes places attractive for people to be in, which means people want to live there. And the truth is that if a place is attractive for people to live in, it will also be attractive for people to visit as tourists, or whatever we want to call them. So I think there's a very logical system which begins to fall in place once you think about it as a more holistic system of placemaking. So for me, tourism is just a label that is used for a certain type of visitor to the city. But for me, it's by no means the most important. And the problem with tourism is that often it's approached from a very narrow economic model, which then tends to exclude all the other effects which tourism has, which includes, as has already been mentioned, bringing new ideas into the city, for example.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd also like to offer to our key speakers an opportunity for comment. Please, Bonnie.
Well, I think we've all been speaking the same language in terms of what we see as desirable. And I think that your question about what is the trigger that would make something start to change in a positive way, that's the critical question. Well, in the cases that I presented, I chose them because the trigger was a negative event. And it was either a catastrophic event from which the community could not recover and realize they were losing ground, or it was an economic event where they knew that they were not going to be able to attract new people unless they did something to change. And I think that the catastrophic event in Venice, the flood, required such a major physical response because the city was already deeply degraded and falling apart at the seams, and so much had to be done to come back to an equilibrium, and there were environmental problems with the water extraction, that the social and the economic side somehow got separated from the goal of fixing the place. And now we find ourselves in the ironic situation that it's been so well fixed that it's now a victim of its own success. And so I think it's the intangibles that are being lost in the process. That's what we're really referring to. The quality of life, the ability for people to continue to live in a way that they cherish. And those are the most important values to try to recover. And I think that getting the message out is the critical thing. And just to finish on an anecdote, I used to have some glasses like this, which I bought in Venice, maybe 20 years ago. And I don't have them anymore. They're all broken. And so in the course of this afternoon, I've been musing to myself, in my 2 free hours on Sunday morning, where could I go to buy some of these and be absolutely sure that they're made in Venice? Because I certainly don't want to go to all the trouble of taking home a Chinese replica of a Venetian glass so that it can be broken in the dishwasher again. And another anecdote of the last couple of days is that as I was walking down a calle that I'm very, very familiar with, that's in a very prosperous part of town, right next to the Accademia, I was looking in the windows and musing at the change in the quality of the merchandise that was available. There were 1 or 2 of the shops I remembered still open, but almost everything was a shop that was selling cheap tourist goods that we're referring to. And I thought, why aren't the people in this neighborhood more proud of the quality of what the neighborhood used to be as presented in the things that it had for sale, which were all local, whether it was cheese or bread or pantoufle or glasses that were actually made in Venice, in jewelry. And there are ways to strengthen that sense of pride, I think. And the French, for example, do it very well. because they have in France something called the Meilleur Ouvrier Award, and maybe other European countries as well, where craftsmanship is given an equal level of recognition to being a very well-recognized writer or a famous historian or what have you. And there may be other ways in which the government reinforces that, those traditions by incentivizing or by strengthening the traditional crafts, because this is something that the society believes in. And I think that it's, I know that it's increasingly difficult for the society and at greater and greater cost in France to support those initiatives, but they continue to do so because they continue to value them. And I wondered whether it wouldn't be possible to have a rigorously enforced, as a starting point, made in Venice designation, that somebody, maybe there already is such a thing, but if not, that somebody awards, like the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval, that really means that that this item is made in Venice, and that would help to underscore the importance of the local craft traditions and perhaps expand into other intangible areas.
Thank you very much. Joan, a comment?
No, I would add to the discussion, because it's more like an open brainstorming that we said, but it seems to me that one important element that I think we agree upon, that all these operations, like making the city and the region safe from the flood, is something, from the flooding, that is something that can be really more shared, is the way, because of course it's been all this corruption stuff and all these things, but I think those elements, if they could be more, perhaps they are already, yeah, more participated by the local residents, or even residents from Mestre or from other places, because in a way that they can feel that that is providing safety to the region, to the business that they have. I think always is very important that when the public sector is investing, that the people share, trust, and watch and witness. I mean, this is what, also that avoids many other cases of that they are appropriated only for a politician, that they feel that is their own piece of work. You know, so I think that helps. The other is that it seems to me that it's very important to take into account the existing activities, that they are important and they are able to be better, that they are already in the island, in the place. Because I feel there is students, I mean, there are quite a lot of activities that if they could be with programs that doesn't take a lot of effort, doesn't take a lot of money, in a way, if you can, and I think my experience is all the important policies, they start by some pilot projects. Imagine if you try to get, because there are some buildings that they are almost falling down, that you can get these buildings, you restore this building, even with young fellows from the UAP, these type of things, and then you put 10 students. And I mean, these type of things help a lot, because it gives another direction. I feel it's very important. In place of stopping, I think it's better to create positive elements. Honestly, I have to say that, well, I've been in Venice always as a tourist, quite often as a tourist, as professional, or visiting the university, or this, but always feeling as a tourist. And I have the feeling that I agree that the level of the tourism is growing, but the quality is not growing, which I think is bad. That you have to react into that, but not stopping the tourists. You just make something that makes right. When you see what been happen in the 20th century, when you see this amount of work that these guys were doing, meaning that they have a project in a long term, but that doesn't mean because you have a project in a long term that you put a lot of public money. It's not that the case, but you have a strategy. Then you can select tactically what is the better. Even when there is one mayor that they prefer more housing or more shops, okay, then the strategy can be really adapted in the way. But I feel the city needs to get something important. As far as I know, I mean, the city has a biennale that attracts a lot of people. I mean, they have a lot of elements that they are very positive. The museums are very good. I mean, there's a way that they are at a certain level that you can say, if you make a research about that, those are positive elements. But the thing is that the strategies that should go more to the other side, that means as we said before, the affordable housing, places where perhaps some crafts can be. But attention, if not the crafts can be on the other places. I mean, in the Veneto, they are competing China. Benetton is I mean, it's the way that there are other strategies that could very well happen. Sorry.
Okay, I don't know if Richard is still with us on the screen. If so, can we have it on the screen? Is he still around? Richard,
sure.
Hi. So, Richard, you have heard the comments, please.
I would raise one other issue. When I wrote my book on the Jewish ghetto in Venice, which was created in the 16th century, one thing that struck me, although it was a book about segregation and isolation, was that Venice was an international city that even took in Jews, heathens, took in Muslims, and so on. And that a lot of its strength came from its very peculiar cosmopolitan center as basically the capital of the Mediterranean. I don't know if this is germane to the discussions you'll have in the next day, but that serving as the capital of the Mediterranean is something that has ceased in Venice. And it's like everywhere else in Europe, foreigners, outsiders, not tourists, but I mean people who come to work in Venice or refugees are seen as alien elements. And I wonder if one aspect of its resilience, Francesco, to go back to the question you asked, is to recover itself as a center that is able to take in foreigners around the Mediterranean, to be the capital of the Mediterranean, again, to be a more cosmopolitan place. Tourists could or could not be an element of that kind of cosmopolitanism. But I think the more important thing is to understand that what was a social strength of Venice, just as it was the social strength of modern Barcelona, was in Barcelona at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was that the city felt itself strong enough to draw on the energies of immigrants. And as I say, I mean, this is not so much a physical question as a social question, but I feel it's a very urgent one for Venice now. It's a way that it could become resilient again. It intersects with reviving the labor economy in Venice. But it may be that immigrants, as they have done in New York and are now doing in London, would help the city come back to life.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite a point. Now, we have a little time for a second round of comments, maybe a little shorter. So I would like to put you in another perspective, which I think belongs to this session. As you know, a global art city, major success, Venice has gone in the past decades to a radical human ecological change. We have the population has shrunk, the resident population has shrunk, many moved to the mainland, which, by the way, creates today this very strange situation that you have correctly pointed in your paper, that, you know, in fact, most of the voters are not in the city. So when we talk about the future of the city, most of the voters are not here. So the politicians look at the voters, don't they? Okay, so but the ecology of the city is human ecology has dramatically changed. You're foreign, so you don't know that in the center of town there is a square where a pharmacy shows every day the number of people living in Venice. So every day goes down. Very depressing, you know, it looks like a social desert. But Venice is not a social desert. In fact, sometimes we feel it's overpopulated. Why? Because there are many communities that populate the city. Of course, the residents, the 55,000 left, but there are lots of students, lots of commuters, lots of tourists of very different types. We talk about tourists, but you know, there are at least 10 types of tourists that come here, so we have to be much more analytical. So I always feel that Venice, in fact, has a lot of communities. Most of them don't have a voice, you know, in anything, in any sort of, you know, political or cultural discussion. So how do you build this future that we talk about? We talk about a future is made of people deciding, you know. How do you make it in a situation where the human ecology has been so transformed, and whether it is positive or negative, I'm not judging, it's just saying that it is fragmented in a way that it doesn't allow a real recomposition of a community. Maybe you are, as a specialist of communities in crisis, Mr. Meni, what do you tell us?
Well, first, I would like to quote Lord Keynes, who said that in the long term we all be dead. So if we want to think about the future, I would rally fully the position which was exposed by Charles. We have to bet on young people. They are the future. And a policy to rescue Venice has to bring young people to Venice. And the most vibrant cities in Europe, Barcelona, London, Berlin, Amsterdam, are cities which attract young people. So Venice has to attract young people. And Venice, to also go along with what was said by Richard, Venice has to become again cosmopolitan, which is not, there is no contradiction. That is, young people from many other places. And in order to do that, there is no miracle solution. You have to take a lot of small decisions. I remember, for instance, Il Barrio Gótico in Barcelona was, in the past, a place which was a place for drugs, prostitution, and poverty. And little by little, the municipality has managed to transform this neighborhood. So it requires persistence in action, it requires imagination, it requires innovation, but it's feasible. I also remember the American cities in the 70s. I remember Boston, which was the center of Boston in the 70s, was a city of homeless people, drug addicts, and prostitutes, just that. And they were started to renovate Quincy Market, which has become then a place for meeting and commercial. So it's not that Venice is lost for the future, but something has to be done.
Pierre.
Has grown in context. And I was triggered by Busquets' idea, and if I understand you right, is, you know, maybe we've been too much focused on Venice itself, the little island with all its monuments. And the solution may well be to look beyond Venice, to look at the mainland. I mean, Venice was big not in itself, but at the cost of the mainland. This has always been the case. And now we try to find a solution within the walls of Venice. And I think, for example, Landry's proposal, we have to attract the young. Well, I've been involved also in Amsterdam in the whole sense of sensible city initiative of Boston, and we recognize there that indeed the young transform the city. And if it's so difficult to generate affordable housing in Venice, it may be much easier to reconstruct Marghera, which is at crisis now, build houses there that are affordable for people to live there and revive and take in their in their wake vanish with it. I mean, if you want young, I think it's going to be politically very difficult to transform all the palaces into youth hostels. But I mean, the mainland has lots of possibilities. And and personally, I've always been very much focused on the lagoon. I hear so little about the lagoon. In the Netherlands, we have a big tourist attraction, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage, which is a lagoon. People come for the lagoon and for ecotourism. I cannot understand why it has not been developed in Venice. It's unbelievable. I mean, people travel to the Galapagos, but the lagoon is as unique, especially if you take the whole story with it, the narrative. So I would make at least a proposal to look beyond the city and look for solutions beyond the city as well.
But this is what more or less you were saying also, Joan, no? Because think large, cities are large, and Barcelona is doing that, right?
No, I think what is important, because in fact we should not, in my eyes, or I should not be in a position of making any proposal in Venice. The things needs to be studied seriously. The only thing is that we are just brainstorming with things that we know from other cities that we feel perhaps deserves to be studied. I mean, this is what, but I fully agree that there are a lot of potentials, and research should be done, studies should be done to open up all other windows. And perhaps you open 5 windows and finally you take only 2. But you have to explore more things to see that then perhaps you need even more tourists than the ones that you have, because you have more capacities. And I think this is what is very important in that. But nevertheless, I would really will make a point in relation with the process, the small process that, in my eyes, Venice needs to be done. I mean, it seems to me it's not possible that you don't, that, I don't know, it should be the city, the state, but to do some actions on housing for young people, for students, these type of things doesn't cost you a lot of money, but it creates immediately a change. I always feel that what is more important is the small changes. That's the one that create different. The cities are never built by one shot. They are always built by small changes that then you make another route.
Thank you. Bonnie, on this issue of cities and their balance, there is a question from the floor that says, today, a restaurant is open and is managed by migrants, migranti, as we say. Okay, very good, they say. It's good to integrate migrants, but this is not enough, because to really regenerate Venice, you have to start increasing the number of inhabitants. What have you seen in your experience in this field?
Yes, this is a problem everywhere. From my experience, when tourism develops, it's often by people with resources from abroad, and often the money does not stay in the local economy. Let's take Angkor as an example, where all of this huge hotel development hasn't benefited the local community hardly at all. But you do have, this is an old city, and you have deep traditions that ought to be possible to retap. And if there's not a way to find, and I want to say that I completely agree with your 2 points, that the mainland is an untapped resource in this city. And when the US cities started to redevelop, it was always the waterfront. Boston, it happened to be close to the historic core, but in Baltimore, in New York, those waterfront areas that were redeveloped, or San Francisco, for huge economic development in the long term were somewhat isolated and economically depressed areas when they started. That's really why they started in those places. But I do think that you have to take a long-term view. And some of these examples that I cited that have now, it's so easy to tell the story, it took 20 or 30 years to get to that point. And it was because of a vision from the beginning. In Denver, they didn't do that railway project. It was finished last year. And they still have more to add, but they always had that vision. And the idea of visioning really has to, you can encourage it, you can facilitate it, but people in the community have to believe in it.
And yes, thank you. Charles, the same idea. I mean, how can creativity be the motor for regeneration?
To reiterate the point that I agree with, I think what one needs to do, I'll come to the point, think big and start small, perhaps, or strategic instrumentalism, which always means you have to have a picture of where you want to go. Now, my own view of creativity has slightly shifted over time. Initially, when I sort of developed the idea of the creative city in the late 80s, I really focused on distinctiveness and the role of arts and culture and all of that in it, because the renewed globalization was sort of creating a real problem. Over time, I still think that's all very important, but what I think now, the focus of creativity depends on each situation and should focus on what really matters. And what really matters needs to be discussed locally. The thing that I think our attention should go to is really the bureaucracy, the creative bureaucracy, because there are many examples around the world of bureaucracies that invent and reinvent regulation and incentive systems that deal with wicked, intractable problems. And so that's one area of the focus of creativity. Another, I think, is given the sort of spaghetti of problems and, I mean, the power spaghetti, I mean, not spaghetti to eat, this intractability, I really think one's got to focus on how can one send out a message or tell a story that manages to get through that. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that really has to be a focus. And given that many people seem to be very satisfied with how things are, one should perhaps develop, as one or two cities have. Crisis is always a useful stimulation for creativity, we know. It always is, the different forms of crisis. But the particular crisis that I would like to stress here is to generate a crisis of aspiration. And that of the aspiration of what could be. Now, in general, if we say creativity and how do you unleash it, there are four sort of clusters of things that I think the city needs to attend to. The primary thing about all creativity or innovation or any of these discussions is always that openness is a key thing. Openness is the central point. The second point in this unleashing that is a learning landscape that is rich, a rich discussion culture. The second thing is that there's a political framework and incentives and regulations regime and strategic agility that sort of enables and force feeds that. The third thing is there's entrepreneurial programs that incubate ideas which therefore harness and exploit that potential. And finally, there is a lived experience of this city that is quite open, that encourages that curiosity to move again in a virtuous cycle. And what you then ultimately have, I think, is 5 points. You have a sense of anchorage in place, the familiar, the known, heritage, all of that sort of stuff. A place of possibility, can-do options. A place of connections, the global thing we just talked about. Some forms of inspiration. And that's all I've got to say for the moment.
Thank you. Greg, I think it touches on your area. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the points raised about the need for ambition are very important. The need for vision and a long-term view, and the question that Richard Sennett raised about, you know, why isn't Venice the capital of the Mediterranean, comes down to the fact that, you know, Barcelona claimed that title because it had the vision to see that that's the position that it should take. And it had the structures and the processes in place to make that vision a reality. But of course, that didn't happen overnight. It's a process which has taken 30 or 40 years to get to the position where you can really claim that you are the capital of the Mediterranean or the West Mediterranean or whatever it happens to be. So in all these things, you have to have a clear vision of where it is you want to go, whether it's attracting the young people, whether it's changing the nature of the lived environment, whatever it happens to be. And the problem is then, well, who gives that vision? Because it can't be left to the politicians. Because if the politicians create a vision, that vision is not going to be shared immediately by all the other stakeholders that are involved. So it has to be a shared vision. And that involves moving a lot of people, convincing a lot of people that there is a need to make important decisions. And this is why it's interesting to be here 50 years on from the Great Flood, because that was a moment at which people were easily convinced that there was a need for change and revisioning and everything else. At the moment, it's not so easy because, we haven't had a great flood which has had catastrophic consequences in the same way that it did 50 years ago. So where is the sense of urgency coming from now? How can we create that? So there needs to be some thinking about, what are the driving forces which are impelling Venice towards realizing the need for change, which can then bring people together to agree on what needs to be done.
Thanks a lot, and maybe Charles for a comment. We don't have much time, but please.
Well, I'll make them brief then. Just two observations. One, I hope there'll be many visions. I'd hate to think that there was a sort of unique driving vision that's going to determine everything that happens in Venice in the future. I think what you want is to give people an opportunity to realize different possible futures, to create an environment that allows people to be innovative in several different areas, in many different areas of the Venetian economy. Second thing is, Pierre started us thinking about broadening the horizons beyond the island, but we need to broaden the horizons to the rest of the globe, because everything that occurs in Venice occurs within a global context. And if you just were to take the example of tourism, there's a world market in tourism that the Venetians have some capacity to ride, some capacity to direct, some capacity to alter through innovative actions. And what one would like to see is a sequence of innovative actions occurring automatically. Create the environment in which people can flourish, create the environment in which new ideas can take place. That's much more valuable than having a guiding vision that itself may get us locked into the next problems.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think Richard is still with us. I'd like to give him the floor for a final comment if he's here.
Well, I just wonder how are you going to take this forward? I'm sorry I won't be with you tomorrow, but how are you going to take forward some of these ideas tomorrow? I mean, what are you looking for? Maybe, Francesco, you can tell me, what comes out of this?
I'm not sure I'm the one that has a full answer, but I think I can try, although the president is here. I think this conference is an attempt to restart thinking about the city. We had a feeling that because of the nature of the situation, the political situation, etc., the vision that is provided by the decision makers is very fragmented and very short term. So we try to do the opposite, try to have a more integrated and perhaps a little bit longer vision. I'm always worried when I talk about vision, because a friend of mine once told me, if you have a vision, go see your optometrist. But I think we need to have at least middle, not long to long term, but middle term, a middle long term perspective on the city. And this is really dramatically lacking. All the things that we're discussing here, none of the projects that we are discussing here is a short term project. All of them involve decision-making processes, involve mobilization of resources, intellectual, financial, using the great attractiveness of this city. This city attracts everybody. Everybody wants to come here and perhaps be part of this future. I think this is the beauty of the place. Venice, offers this platform. You may not want to go to another place, but here, if you are solicited, you come. You're here, by the way. I think we have a great potential, and the past 30 years I've offered, of course, I've provoked some social changes, sometimes crises and so on, but also really enriched the life of the city. We have some of the most important art exhibitions and institutions in the world. And for the size of Venice, which is a relatively small city, this is a big place in the map of culture and art. So we have to also look at the positive effects that this change has brought. I think we don't have that perspective, that middle long-term perspective. And I think the intention of this conference, and I would like to thank the president, Bazzoli, to really have stimulated this, is to have bring together people in a kind of a laboratory of ideas that has not been around for at least 25 years that I remember, to establish this kind of exchange and perhaps then convey it to the decision makers. There was a question from the floor, which I cannot answer, but I read it to you. How could you make sure that the results of the symposium will be taken into consideration by the management authorities of Venice? I think the only way to be heard by the politicians is to have a strong voice. So if we have a strong voice, we will be heard. And if we can even use this opportunity to perhaps say, well, it's not just a conference, but it's a beginning of a reflection process, maybe a beginning of a laboratory, as I said, of ideas that could periodically take into account what's happening in the city. Then I think this will be a great legacy for the city, and perhaps it will be heard by the politicians. Now, I don't know if I've answered your question, Richard, but I think we are getting to the end of our time. But it's not the end of the conference. There is another session tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Sustainability Strategies and Models of Governance, which will be very exciting, I'm sure. So I'd like to, with your permission, to thank all of the panelists, and I'd like to ask you to join me in an applause to them for this very interesting session. I think what we have done in a world, I think we opened the Pandora's box. Now all the evils are in the air, and it's for us to capture them tomorrow. Thank you very much.